Yes, Madam Chair. At this time, members of the board, Ms. Cindy Lisinski, our Chief Financial Officer, will provide the board and viewing audience a budget update. Ms. Lisinski and Mr. Collins. Ms. Lisinski will introduce Mr. Rick Collins, and toward the later part of the presentation, I'll actually join Ms. Lisinski and provide some additional information to the board.
So good morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Rick Collins. Rick has served in the auditing and financial management fields for over 41 years. Rick started his career as an auditor, focusing mainly on school districts, and it's my hunch that he must have audited the Orange County Public Schools more than once, and they decided to hire him versus having more write-ups from Rick Collins. So he worked for the Orange County Public Schools for over 11 years and assumed the number 2 position for financial operations in the school of the school district. He then became the CFO of Osceola County Public Schools, where he served for another 11 years. Rick returned back to Orange County, this time as the CFO for the 10th largest school district in the country. That is amazing. Where he served for 10 years until his retirement. During this tenure, Orange County became the top-rated school district in Florida by the major rating agencies, and I'm sure that is because of Rick Collins and all his audit expertise and all the years and years that he has spent in accounting and budget. Since his retirement, he's been working with the Florida Association of District School Superintendents, FADS, helping new superintendents understand the budget and the importance of accounting. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he normally watches his 2 beautiful twin grandbabies. He's here with us today. And today is actually their 6-month birthday. Can you have a 6-month birthday?
He's a grandparent.
So Rick has met me at the door on day 1 as a mentor. He's been helping me all along and helping guide me as I transition into this position as CFO as Brevard. And I'm incredibly grateful for everything that you've done. He has really helped reduce that learning curve. And today Rick will discuss his deep dive analysis of our financial condition and how we compare to local districts.
Well, good morning, board members and Dr. Mullins. Thank you for inviting me to come talk to you today. What I'd like to do is just briefly talk about some of the analysis that I've done for the school district. Again, just taking a look at some of your historical financial data to try to determine sort of where is the district at, sort of a macro look. And I did also take a little bit of a look at your the final conference report as far as how it impacts the school district. I know Cindy's done a much more deeper look at all of the numbers on the conference report, but I'll do some brief analysis on that as well. Okay, the agenda is, again, to take a look at the historical financial data and also to review your 2021 financial conference report data. Let's get right into it. The analysis of the historical financial data, what I did is I took a look at 3 different areas, your expenditures by object, comparing you to some of your peer districts. And when I say peer districts, primarily those districts that are comparable in size. You'll find that districts that are comparable in size generally have similar operations but if you're trying to compare yourselves to a Miami-Dade that's massive, or to like a Jefferson County or an Okeechobee County that's really small, you're going to look very different than they do. But when you start looking at yourselves compared to your peer districts, which are comparable in size, then you should see some similarities. So that's what I tried to do, is to take a look at that. So let's get right into the details. Looking at I went back to fiscal year 2018. When I say fiscal year 2018, it's the 17-18 fiscal year. and I'll show you the details here. It may not be very easy to see. I think you may have the detail reports with you. Okay, let me see if I can make that a little bigger. Okay. You'll notice that when I looked at 2018, and these are expenditures by object. An object is, what the item is, salaries and benefits and equipment, things like that. Nothing really jumped out at me. And again, the purpose of the analysis isn't necessarily to say this number is exactly a certain percentage. And this is, by the way, these numbers are the percentage of your total budget in each category. So the purpose wasn't to go in and say, oh, your number is exactly this or exactly that. It was really to get a feel for any outliers that you may have. I mean, is there something really different about the way Brevard County operates compared to your peer districts? And then why? So I took a look at, again, expenditures by object for 2018, and nothing really jumps out at you that is really out of line with your peer districts. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is that at the time, 2018, your materials and supplies expenditures were slightly higher. And when I say materials and supplies, that also includes textbooks in that category. But your expenditures in that category was slightly higher than your peer districts. And your other expenditures, which is primarily things like your part-time salaries, was actually lower than your peer district. Just nothing right, nothing wrong. It's just that's the way it came out. So there wasn't anything that jumped out at me for 2018. So I went to 2019 to see if there was anything unusual about 2019. And again, nothing really jumps out at you as being out of line. I've done this type of analysis for several school districts throughout the state. So it's amazing what you find out sometimes when you start looking at comparisons with your peer districts. But Brevard doesn't really stick out like a sore thumb in any particular category. Again, your other expenditures here are slightly lower than your peer districts, and that just has to do with how you're classifying certain expenditures. Okay, let's move on. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the expenditures by function. Now, the functional area is sort of where, or the purpose of the expenditure. The Red Book accounting, have you guys heard of the Red Book? It basically tells you how you're supposed to categorize all of your expenditures. The Red Book basically tells you how to classify that. Based on the Red Book, your expenditures are slightly higher in the instructional technology area. Let me bring up that summary here as well. Okay. Again, your instructional technology area, slightly higher. Again, that's technology that's purchased for use in the schools, for use for instructional purposes. So being a little higher in that would be something that you would actually be proud of. Your general administration area is way down as far as a percentage of your total expenditures. It's an indication of efficiency of the operation of the superintendent and his staff. It may also be an indication that you're classifying expenditures with some flexibility based on the guidelines in the Red Book. That may be a little different than some of your peers. It may be a little of both. I didn't get down to that level of detail to figure out why, but it really does not indicate that you're spending more than your peers in that area. It actually indicates you're spending less. Administrative technology would be your business ERP system, and you can see that you're actually spending less than your peer districts on as far as the percentage of your total. And then the transportation services, you're actually spending less than your peer districts on as a percentage of your total budget. Now, that may be an indication of efficiency, which I think it actually is, or it also may be a function of actually transporting fewer students as a proportion of your total. That's something we would have to dig into deeper to see if that's the case. But again, nothing jumps out at you as being unusual about your expenditures. Okay, this area I wanted to spend a little bit more time about over. It's basically your reserve levels of the school district. Something called a financial condition ratio. Have any of you heard of that term before, financial condition ratio? The state actually uses that term in measuring whether or not a school district may be in a state of financial emergency. In fact, there are thresholds below which you have to, if you go below that, when you hit the 3% threshold, you actually have to provide notice to the commissioner that you may be entering a state of financial emergency. If you go below 2%, then you have to come up with a plan that you have to submit to the state, which they have to review and approve. That's a financial emergency avoidance plan if you hit 2%. Now, fortunately for Brevard, you're not in that range as far as your financial condition ratio. Now, what is a financial condition ratio? Let's just talk a little bit about what it is. GASB 54 actually determines how you classify your year-end fund balance. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board, so every school district should be using similar classifications. There are two major categories. One is called non-spendable and one is called spendable. Accountants try to keep it simple, you know. Non-spendable is primarily inventory and prepaid items. Let's just forget about that because those aren't spendable. In the expendable category, you have several categories, and they move from most restrictive all the way to least restrictive. One is called restricted. Again, we keep it simple. Restricted is something that's restricted by law. So you have to use those funds that are left over at the end of the year for restricted purposes. Committed means that this board has taken action to commit a portion of your fund balance for a specific purpose. And you did that as part of your board action, and that those particular items are listed in your notes to your financial statements, what those particular items were. You also have a category called assigned. This is less restrictive than committed, but it's something that the superintendent can assign dollars to out of the fund balance. Things like summer school. Summer school occurs throughout the summer, so if you're partway through the summer school, you may reserve or assign some dollars to finish out your summer school program, that type of thing. And then the final category is unassigned. Now, we'll tell you that in your policy, you actually set aside 3% of your revenues in a contingency fund. That contingency fund is actually part of that unassigned category. Based on the GASB classifications, a reservation like that of your by the board for contingency purposes actually show up in the unassigned category. Now, the financial condition ratio, you take the assigned category and the unassigned. And let me show you the details here. Okay, so you take these last two categories of assigned and unassigned, and you divide it by your revenues. So that's just a mathematical process for calculating the formula. In your case, you're at 8.24%. Is that good? Is that bad? What does it mean? There is literature that is all over the place as far as what the number should be, as far as best practice. I've read some literature that says between 5 and 10% is good. I've seen some literature that says 2 months worth of revenue would be good, which is about 17%. So that's much higher than what you have. The state average is around 10%. So you are slightly less than 10%, or the state average, as far as what your financial condition ratio is. One thing about your financial condition ratio is that it is consistent over time. So by looking at these numbers, you know, in 2015, 8.94%, all the way to 8.24%, there's not a lot of variability in your financial condition ratio every year, which is actually very positive. That's an indication of strong financial management and effective financial management by your superintendent and staff. So that's actually a good thing. The rating agencies, they look at that and they say, hey, what's going on with your financial condition ratio from year to year? If it bounces around, either going up too fast, going down too fast, they get concerned. So they're looking for adequacy, and they're also looking for consistency over time. In your case, it's been very consistent over time, which is a good thing. Now, what do you use your reserves for? Why do you need a certain level of reserves? Well, primarily for unforeseen circumstances. That's why you have to have an adequate reserve level, is to cover any potential unforeseen circumstance, such as a hurricane. Being here in Brevard County, when a hurricane hits, you have to outlay cash in a hurry to start fixing up things, paying people overtime, those types of things. Those dollars initially will come out of some pot of money. So you need to have some kind of reserve pot to use that. Now, you eventually get reimbursed either by insurance or by FEMA for much of that cost, but it takes years, literally it takes years to get reimbursed sometimes from FEMA. So you have to have that pot of money that you can lean on to get those things done that have to be done to cover those unforeseen circumstances. Another reason for having a reasonable reserve is a mid-year revenue adjustment. I don't know if any of you guys were around back in fiscal year 2008. Mid-year major adjustment, downward, partway through the year. You already had all your contracts in place with your faculty members and everybody else, and all of a sudden the state says, we were just kidding about those revenues we told you about. We're actually lowering those substantially. So that's another good reason for having a reasonable financial condition ratio. I think I covered all the points on the slide, so I'll just move on. Okay, what I'm going to do now is just shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the 2020-21 financial final conference report. One of the categoricals this year was kind of confusing, to be honest with you, is the total funds compression allocation. So I was asked to take a look at it and see what happened. The purpose of the categorical allocation is to move your total per student funding of districts that are below the state average closer to the state average. So it's a noble purpose. So those of you who are being funded on a per student basis less than the state average, you're trying to move closer to the state average. So that's what that purpose of that additional funding is for. And what they do is they look at your total per student funding and they say, okay, we'll give you 25% of the difference between what you're getting and what the state average is. And so that moves you slightly towards that state average. However, there is a little bit of a caveat. The state legislature only appropriates a certain amount of money for that categorical. So they'll do the calculation and say, okay, you're entitled to this amount of money, but then they'll look at their bottom line and say, but we don't really have enough to fund that, so we'll do a proration of it. So that's what happened for the 2020-21 conference report. Let me show you the actual calculation here. Okay. And again, I don't want to bore you with the weeds here, other than the fact that
Mr. Collins, I would suggest these are good weeds.
Okay.
For our community and our board to understand, given the discussion we're going to have shortly about budget.
Okay.
Yes, can you just very briefly, you talked about this allocation because for the districts that are below the state average, can you give us like a 20-second why districts like Brevard County are receiving below average funding per student? I know the district cost differential is not a 20-second statement, but if you can give us, for our listening public, why are we receiving less than the state average?
Okay. Would you mind if I wait until the next slide to show you that?
Yes.
Because when we look at the total funding,
No, I don't mind.
We'll
Yes,
talk
please
about
do.
that. Okay. On this particular categorical, you'll see that your $71.58 is your funds below the statewide average at the time of this calculation. Also, remember, this is based on the prior 2 years' data. It's not based on current data. It's actually based on the 2020 data, and then it's also based on the 2019 data. So they actually go back to completed years to do the calculation. Well, 2020 isn't completed yet, but so it's kind of confusing, first of all, because they're using completely different numbers than they're using in the 2021 conference report. So that's one of the confusing parts, is they're using historical data. And so in your case, you're $71 below, so they should take 25% of that, which would be $17.90, times your number of students, your actual FTE. So your calculated number should be $1.3 million. That's what you should get for your first calculation compression allocation. Now, you only got $917,000. And why is that? It's because of the proration. So, and one thing that comparing to last year is interesting is that the actual calculation, you were $613,000 less than last year, but that's because you were actually moving closer to the state average. So the good news is that you're actually moving towards the state average, but the bad news is that you're still below it. And the bad news is that the compression allocation was prorated this year to the tune of $394,000 that you didn't get, or you won't get, because of the proration. So does that kind of make sense? That's important to understand why. Now, that's one of the answers to your question, is that why are you below the state average? Is this compression allocation would eventually catch you up, but they don't always fully fund it. The state legislature doesn't fully fund it, so you kind of lag behind a little bit. That's part of the answers to your question. And let's go on to the next slide.
Mr. Collins, were you
Yes.
going to address here or later what the revenue difference would have been if we were funded at the state average?
Yes, sir. The total difference would have been $7.8 million. That's actually on my summary slide, but I'll mention it now as well, is that if we were actually funded at the statewide average for the 2021 fiscal year, your total funding would be $7.8 million higher than your proposed budget will be for 2020 and 21. Okay. Yeah, let's move right on into that next one, which is the look at the total conference report. And I'll bring up the slide. It's kind of a busy slide, but I'll kind of explain what it means. If I can zoom in a little bit. I'll just leave it out there. You guys have a copy of it. But what I did is I just took a look at your peer districts to see how they're funded, and look at Brevard County, how it's funded on a per FTE basis. So the left side of the screen here just shows the total numbers coming right out of the conference report. And then the per FTE is a calculation showing what each of your school districts would look like on a per FTE basis in each of the categories of the FEFP calculation included in the conference report. So a few things to note is that your tax base is actually stronger than most of your peers, except for Volusia County. And you can tell that in several different areas, like the 0.748 mils compression. You'll see that, again, that's another compression allocation, but it's just compressing the discretionary millage. And you see that Volusia is only $82.80, you're $111 to get to the state average. But you'll see that Osceola, Pasco, and Seminole, their numbers are much higher than yours to get. So what that tells me is that, first of all, your tax base is below the state average, but it's not as much below the state average as Osceola, Pasco, and Seminole, but it's actually better than Volusia. So that's just one thing that tells. So going back to your initial question, that's one reason why your overall numbers are less, is because your funding from your tax base is actually below the state average. That's part of it. Your ESE guaranteed allocation is slightly higher than your peers, which means you have a slightly higher concentration of your ESE students. In the lower 3 categories of classification, ESE, you have a 5-tier matrix for classification of severity of need. The first 3 categories is you get the supplemental funding for ESE guaranteed to help fund the first 3 categories. And you apparently have a slightly higher concentration of ESE students. Therefore, you would get a slightly higher ESE guaranteed allocation. You get a slightly higher allocation for supplemental academic instruction than your peers, slightly higher. That one, when it was created back in the 1990s, had certain metrics that they used to create the SAI allocation, and then it's been adjusted over time based on workload and price level adjustments. So if there were differences that existed back in the 1990s, many of those differences still exist. So they've just been brought forward. So again, that's the differential thing that will cause you to be different than some of the other districts or the state average even. Your transportation allocation is lower than your peers. Again, we talked about that earlier. You're either more efficient in how you're transporting or you're transporting fewer students. Then you do get the federally connected student supplement, which is kind of unique among your peer districts. You have certain federal property that is not taxable. You don't collect property taxes because it's federal property. So you do get a little bit of a supplement from the state to make up for part of that. So that's what that's for. The funding compression, we talked a little bit about that, is that it's lower than your peers, primarily because you're closer to the state average than your peers are right now. The lottery and school recognition allocation, just a caution on that, and I talked to the staff about that as well, because it's based on your test scores. Well, you didn't have testing this year, so we don't really know how that's going to be allocated yet. We know what was budgeted, but that may or may not materialize. And then finally, looking at the report, all of this may be garbage. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen once the governor steps in, because the governor hasn't approved this yet. So the governor may step in and veto it, or veto parts, not necessarily this, but other parts of the budget. The legislature may be required to come in and have a special session. We don't know all of that. Dr. Mullins, maybe you can give us an update on that at some point. But let me go on to the last slide, and then I'll let Cindy take over. So in summary, when you look at the expenditures by object with your peers, there are some differences, but nothing really material, nothing significant. Expenditures by function, again, nothing really significant to jump out at you and require a lot of extra in-depth investigation. Your financial condition ratio indicates consistency of operations over time, and it is slightly below the state average. Again, that shows effective management. The total funds compression adjustment is less because funding is better, but also because of a proration. And again, Brevard Public Schools would have received an additional $7.8 million if funded at the state average per student. And again, there are lots of things that enter into that. The district cost differential is another thing I didn't mention earlier that also can impact your funding. If you're different, the district cost differential is something that basically looks at the cost of living in your district. And hang on a second. Let me back up just a second and cover that one again. In your case, your district cost differential is 0.9877. Okay, so you're less than 1, which means that you're getting less than average funding for because of the district cost differential. That means that based on the study that was done as far as the cost of living here in Brevard County, they determined that it's less than state average. And there's a whole myriad of things that go into that calculation, including what they call an amenity adjustment. If you have waterfront property, they actually adjust that downward somewhat as far as what the cost is there. I won't get into that because I don't really understand it all. They hire economists that do that, and not accountants, apparently. So, whoops. So, again, the last point I wanted to make real quickly again is that the funding for 2021 may change rapidly based on future actions. We don't know when that's going to happen. The governor could make some changes at the time he's actually approving the budget. He could veto certain items, or he may call a special session later on in the year if necessary to get things back on track. Okay. Turn it over to Dr. Mullins.
Rick, before you go, I would just add for the board to recall, during session this year, there was quite a bit of discussion around the DCD, the district cost differential being adjusted based on a new study that would be done or was done, and then also reconsideration of the compression funding line item that Rick spoke to specifically. Those issues, those adjustments were suspended or embargoed for this year, so they did not play into our funding. And it's hard to say exactly what would have happened if DCD would have been recalculated. We anticipate that our 0.9877 would have risen a little bit, so we would have received more funding through the DCD. If I remember correctly, I don't believe it's shown here, but we lose approximately $4 million, a little over $4 million, as a result of just the DCD calculation. But of course, if that would have occurred, then our compression contribution would have gone down because, we would have been. So it's hard to know exactly what the ultimate outcome would have been with the DCD and compression, not knowing where the legislature would have gone. Would they have adopted both? Would it have been one or the other? So I just wanted to remind the board that was up for discussion this year. It was paused. It'll be interesting to see if it's reevaluated for next year's budget.
Okay.
Did any board members have any questions for Mr. Collins? Or we go back to Ms. Lisinski? Thank you so much, Mr. Collins. We appreciate all the work you're doing to support Brevard.
You're welcome, and I'll stick around in case there are further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.